Africa, considered to be the fastest growing continent on the planet with high potential for growth of African economies. But with all that come challenges such as the climate change issue and now the US policy on tariffs. How to deal with that and how Mauritius can find its position in this challenge, we talk to Professor Victor Murinde, who is the Executive Director of the African Economic Research Consortium. Professor Victor Murinde, you are the Executive Director of the African Economic Research Consortium. First of all, we would like to know what is the consortium about and what does it do?
The African Economic Research Consortium, briefly AERC, is a Pan-African institution headquartered in Nairobi, engaging in capacity building for research as well as policy engagement.
And how do you do that? Do you work with governments, educational institutions, financial institutions? How?
Yes, we are a network-based organization. We have a network of economics departments across universities in Africa, including the University of Mauritius here, and we engage university researchers to get involved in cutting-edge research in economics, but we also engage with policymakers to be able to focus on the problems of concern for Africa. We also engage private sector entities. So the network involves the universities, researchers in universities, policymakers in the governments and central banks, and also, of course, the private sector practitioners who are engaged in building African economies.
So talking about Africa, everyone is telling that Africa, all the countries' economies are growing and Africa is the new El Dorado. Is that true?
Oh no, Africa has the greatest potential. Africa has a headroom for growth. Africa is actively engaged in building their own capacities in production, in international trade, and also allowing to make economic blocks within the continent to be able to stand on its own and grow. It has the highest potential. It's, I would say, economic entities, researchers will produce new knowledge to support this growth. And we see Africa optimistically in the growth trajectory for the next coming years.
So you're talking about the increased production and higher growth, but also with more work to be done, more labor engaged. What about sustainable development? What about the issue of climate change, for Africa especially?
Yeah, absolutely. The growth that we forecast takes into account some obstacles, challenges, and attempt by Africans to turn challenges into opportunities. One of them, of course, is climate change. Climate risk was risk number one globally before the COVID-19 pandemic. Climate change remains real, and there has to be ways in which African countries can engage in mitigation of climate risk, in adaptation to climate risk change, and of course in building long-run resilience of Africa against climate risk. And being able to build a consensus among African countries on how they can collectively engage in climate risk mitigation.
Now, in a context of global trade, we've seen the Trump policy about tariffs. How has that affected African countries and also trading partners around the world?
This is of great concern, specifically the escalation of tariffs by the US and how this would impact on trade partners around the world, not least for African trade partners. This raises many problems for Africa in terms of being able to access markets in the US, but also it should be able to create opportunities for Africa to think outside the box, for African countries to think, okay, we have great potential, thanks to the African Union, in building the African Continental Free Trade Area, in terms of how we as Africans can trade among ourselves, how we can build coalitions to be able to trade with the rest of the world. So we need to think outside the box, and this is where the ERC comes in very handy, in terms of being able to devise economic policies, economic tools, the knowledge, the metrics on how we can go against the escalation of tariffs by the US. We cannot simply just sit and wait for this to unfold. Right now, the African Economic Research Consortium must work with African countries to be able to generate policies, to be able to generate strategies that can enable African countries to survive this new change, new threat in terms of the economic externalities that may be associated with the tariffs.
And where does Mauritius position itself in the African economy?
Well, Mauritius is very, very well positioned to actually play a leading role, to continue to play a leading role, even under the given circumstances. Mauritius is very powerful in many sectors, including the financial services industry. Mauritius is also innovating in the area of technology, and especially the fintech. I think that it's such an economy that can be able to come in and mobilize resources and be able actually to uplift the continent. Mauritius is an active member. We would want Mauritius' role to play through universities, and Mauritius working with the African Economic Research Consortium to be able to part of the financial powerhouse of the African continent.
Professor Murinde, thank you very much.